The studio lights were dim that night, not because of a technical failure, but because some truths were never meant to be spoken under full light. The audience noticed it the moment they stepped inside. The usual brightness of the studio was gone, replaced by a muted glow that clung to the walls like fog before dawn. There was no music to lift the mood, no laughter warming the air, only a silence so deliberate it felt rehearsed, as if everyone present had been instructed to hold their breath at the same time. At the center of the stage sat two familiar figures, faces loved by millions, voices known for comfort and warmth. Yet that night, even they seemed altered by the weight of what was about to be said. Their posture was restrained, their expressions measured. This was not performance. There would be no second take. Behind them, the large screen remained dark. When the host finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of the usual enthusiasm. He did not mention ratings. He did not mention promotion. Instead, he offered a single sentence that shifted the room entirely. Tonight was about memory. The screen behind the guests flickered to life, revealing a photograph that needed no introduction. A gentle smile, eyes that once carried both ambition and exhaustion. Yu Menglong, a name that still echoed across headlines, fan forums, and unanswered questions. Though time had passed, his absence had never fully settled. It lingered, unresolved, like a story paused mid-sentence. A soft murmur moved through the audience. Some lowered their heads. Others stared at the screen as if waiting for it to change, as if the image might breathe again. We have been told many things about Yu Menglong. We have been shown the roles, the interviews, the awards. We have memorized his public life so thoroughly that it began to feel complete. Yet completeness is often an illusion carefully maintained by distance. That illusion was about to fracture. Sukai inhaled slowly before speaking. The pause mattered. It was the kind of silence that forms when a person chooses truth over comfort. We have stayed quiet for a long time, he said, not because we did not care, but because the truth did not belong to us. Songyun did not look at the camera. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, as if the words she carried were heavy enough to fall. There was someone the world never knew, she said. Someone who loved him without applause. The air in the room shifted. The audience leaned forward instinctively, drawn by a tension that felt intimate, almost intrusive. The host asked the question everyone had already formed but hesitated to voice. You mean his girlfriend? The silence that followed was absolute. Sukai nodded once. Not the relationship people imagine, he said. Not rumors. Not headlines. Something quieter. Something that required sacrifice. On the screen, the image changed. Not red carpets. Not cameras. Instead, blurred footage from the edges of forgotten moments. A woman standing just outside the frame. Always present. Never centered. Her face obscured. Her name withheld. Yet her absence from history suddenly felt intentional rather than accidental. This was the first crack in the story we thought we understood. And as we would soon learn, when a truth is hidden long enough, it does not disappear. It waits. It lingers. It becomes a ghost, haunting those who promised to protect it. What they were about to reveal was not a scandal, but a truth that had been deliberately buried to protect someone who could no longer defend himself. The story of Yu Menglong did not begin under studio lights. It began far from applause, in years that no one ever rewound on screen. Before the awards, before the crowded schedules, before the carefully managed image, there was a man unsure whether his dreams had a place in the world that demanded certainty. Records from that period are thin. A few early auditions, projects that did not move forward, long stretches of waiting. Friends from those years would later describe him as driven, but quietly fragile. He worked harder than he admitted. He doubted more than he showed. The confidence the public came to admire was still under construction. It was during this unremarkable time that she entered his life, not as a revelation, not as a dramatic turning point. There was no cinematic meeting, no grand declaration. According to those who knew them, she simply stayed. She appeared when there was nothing to gain from proximity. No cameras, no reputation to borrow, only uncertainty. She was not part of the industry. She did not attend premieres. She did not learn how to smile for interviews or position herself within a frame. Her absence from public memory was not accidental. It was structural. She existed outside the machinery that would later define him. Those closest to Yu Menglong recall how different he became in her presence. Not louder, not brighter, quieter, grounded, as if something inside him was allowed to rest. In a life driven by expectation, she became the place where expectation dissolved. When his career finally began to accelerate, the rules changed without warning. Attention followed him everywhere. Admiration came in waves. With it arrived scrutiny, speculation, and a constant hunger for access. Fame did not knock. It entered forcefully, rearranging everything in its path. It was then that the question first arose. What place does love have in a life that belongs to the public? She understood the danger before he did. Those who spoke with her later described a woman acutely aware of the cost of visibility. She did not fear being known. She feared what being known would do to him. The pressure, the distortion, the way affection could be repackaged into rumor, then weaponized. So she stepped back, not suddenly, not bitterly, gradually, intentionally. She did not vanish from his life, but she removed herself from the narrative others would one day try to write. She learned how to stand at the edge of photographs, how to arrive after events ended, how to leave before questions began. To the world, Yu Menglong appeared alone. To him, she remained constant. In private moments, he spoke of her not as a secret, but as a necessity. The person who reminded him to eat when schedules erased hunger. The one who listened when applause became noise. The one who told him it was acceptable to be afraid, even as the world demanded strength. This arrangement was not romanticized by those who witnessed it. It was exhausting. It required discipline. It demanded erasure. She carried the knowledge that her love would never be validated publicly, that she would never be thanked by the fans who adored him. That history would likely forget her entirely. She accepted this, not because she lacked self-worth, but because she understood something the public often does not. Loving a star is not an elevation. It is a narrowing. It is choosing to become smaller so someone else can remain large enough to survive the weight placed upon them. Sukai would later describe her as an anchor, not visible above the surface, but essential to preventing drift. Without her, he said, Yu Menglong might have floated too far into an identity he could not return from. Songyun recalled moments when Yu Menglong spoke about exhaustion not as a physical state, but as a moral one. The fatigue of performing stability. The burden of being endlessly accessible. With her, those performances ended. In the public imagination, relationships thrive on recognition. In their reality, recognition was the threat. She chose the shadows deliberately. She chose to be unnamed, unseen, unrecorded. Each choice was a small disappearance, repeated until absence became her defining feature. And yet, within that absence, she remained the most stable presence in his life. This is the part of the story that unsettles those who hear it, because it reframes devotion not as proximity, but as restraint, not as visibility, but as withdrawal. It forces an uncomfortable realization that sometimes love is not what stands beside the spotlight, but what steps away from it. As Yu Menglong's fame expanded, so did the distance she maintained from the world that consumed him. The closer he moved toward public immortality, the further she receded into private obscurity. She did not ask to be remembered. She asked to be useful. And in doing so, she ensured that the man the world admired did not lose the man she loved. But loving a star was never a fairy tale. It was learning how to disappear so someone else could remain visible. Fame did not arrive as a single moment. It accumulated, quietly at first, then all at once. Each successful project added another layer of expectation. Another obligation disguised as opportunity. Schedules tightened. Privacy thinned. The distance between the man and the image bearing his name grew wider with every appearance. Those around Yu Menglong noticed the change before he admitted it himself. He slept less, ate when reminded, laughed on cue. His calendar filled months in advance, leaving little room for the unstructured time that once allowed him to feel whole. What the public read as momentum, his inner circle recognized as erosion. Behind closed doors, the strain became visible. In interviews, he spoke of gratitude. In private, he spoke of exhaustion that sleep could not repair. He described a sensation of being watched even when alone, of rehearsing expressions in mirrors, of learning how to appear effortless while internally calculating the cost of every gesture. This was the paradox of his success. The more he was admired, the less space he had to exist without observation. It was during this period that his health began to falter. Nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded headlines. Just a series of warnings easy to dismiss in an industry trained to minimize weakness. Fatigue, dizziness, a persistent tightness in his chest that he attributed to stress. He did not tell the public. He did not want to. When he finally sought medical attention, it was done quietly. No announcements, no statements. A hospital corridor without photographers. A room without reporters. The kind of place where identity briefly loosens its grip. She was there, not as a partner introduced to staff, not as someone claiming proximity. She arrived without ceremony and stayed without question, sitting beside him through long hours of waiting, speaking little, offering presence rather than reassurance. When he closed his eyes, she remained. When he woke, she was still there. Sukai later described that night as the first time he saw Yu Menglong truly rest. Not sleep, rest. As if the effort of maintaining his public self had been temporarily suspended. In that room, stripped of roles and expectations, he allowed himself to be weak. He admitted fears he never voiced elsewhere. That he was replaceable. That the admiration might vanish as quickly as it arrived. That one day the world would move on, leaving him frozen in a version of himself he no longer recognized. She listened without interruption. This was not the glamorous romance audiences imagine. There were no declarations, no dramatic vows, just endurance, quiet loyalty, the kind of devotion that operates without witnesses. As his career continued, the pressure intensified. Each success demanded a greater return, longer hours, more visibility, fewer boundaries. The machine did not pause to consider the person inside it. She understood this better than anyone. There were moments when she suggested stepping back, reducing commitments, protecting what remained of his health. He smiled at these suggestions with affection and resignation. He did not believe retreat was permitted, not for someone standing where he stood. In public, his smile never wavered. In private, it faded quickly. Songyun recalled a conversation that occurred months before his death. Yu Menglong spoke about fatigue not as a complaint, but as an inevitability. He said he felt as though he was slowly disappearing behind the version of himself everyone loved. "When I am with her," he said, "I do not have to be strong." That sentence lingered long after he finished speaking. It revealed more than any confession could. Strength, in his world, was not a virtue. It was a requirement. Weakness had become contraband. With her, that rule no longer applied. In the final months of his life, his appearances remained flawless. The performances continued. Interviews proceeded as planned. Nothing outward suggested decline. This was not an accident. It was discipline. A man trained to deliver consistency even as his internal landscape collapsed. The distance between those two realities became unbearable. He spoke to her about contingency, about disappearance, about what it would mean if he could no longer sustain the pace demanded of him. These were not conversations he shared with management or press. They were spoken late at night, when the world finally receded enough to allow honesty. "If one day I cannot stand on the stage anymore," he said, "promise me something." She asked what he meant. "Promise me you will not cry in front of the world." The request was not about pride. It was about control, about protecting the last fragment of himself that had not yet been consumed. He did not want his absence turned into spectacle. He did not want grief repackaged into narrative. She promised. This promise would later be misunderstood by many, interpreted as abandonment, as erasure. But at the time it was made, it was an act of preservation, a mutual decision to keep something sacred beyond the reach of interpretation. As his condition worsened, he continued to show up, continued to smile, continued to be everything the world expected. The performance did not falter until it ended entirely. When the news of his death broke, shock followed immediately. Then speculation. Then analysis. The familiar cycle activated without delay. Questions multiplied faster than answers. She did not participate. She vanished exactly as she had promised. Not because she lacked grief, but because she honored the only request he had made without compromise. And in doing so, she became invisible at the precise moment the world demanded visibility. In his final months, he was smiling for the world, but slowly disappearing from himself. When Yu Menglong died, the world reacted exactly as it always does. News alerts arrived before grief had time to form. Social media filled with speculation, admiration, and demands for answers. Timelines were reconstructed by strangers. Motives were invented. Every silence became suspicious. What followed was not remembrance. It was consumption. In this environment, absence was treated as guilt. Anyone who did not speak was assumed to be hiding something. Anyone who declined visibility was accused of indifference. The public did not yet understand that silence can be deliberate, that restraint can be a form of loyalty. She did not release a statement. She did not attend public memorials. She did not correct inaccuracies. To many, this behavior seemed cold. To those who knew the promise she had made, it was devastatingly consistent. She disappeared not from grief, but into it. Sukai later explained that her decision was not impulsive. It had been discussed long before Yu Menglong's death, during moments when the future felt fragile. They had spoken openly about the cost of exposure, about how easily love could be reshaped into spectacle once the person at its center could no longer respond. They agreed that if fate forced them apart, the world would not be invited into the aftermath. This agreement confused those who learned of it later. Why protect a story after the man was gone? Why hide a love that could humanize him further? Why deny fans a narrative they were eager to embrace? The answer was simple, but difficult to accept. Because once grief becomes public property, it no longer belongs to the living. She understood that revealing herself would not honor him. It would transform her into a symbol, a role, a device through which others could process loss without bearing its weight. She would be asked to speak for him, to confirm interpretations, to supply closure. She refused all of it. In doing so, she preserved the last place where he had been allowed to exist without explanation. There is a concept often overlooked in discussions of memory. When a truth is withheld long enough, it does not fade. It changes form. It becomes what some psychologists describe as a ghost memory. Not supernatural, but persistent. An unresolved presence that lingers in those who carry it. For Sukai and Songyun, this presence became heavier with time. They were guardians of a story that no longer belonged solely to the past. It pressed against them during anniversaries, during interviews, during moments when his name was spoken without context. They knew the truth would eventually surface. The question was when and how. Years passed. The sharpness of grief dulled, but the absence remained defined. It was no longer raw, but it was no longer private either. Fans matured. Conversations shifted from shock to reflection. The cultural noise quieted enough to allow something gentler to be heard. That was when she reached out, not to reclaim him, not to step forward, but to release what had been held too tightly for too long. She entrusted Sukai and Songyun with a single message. There were no conditions, no requests for recognition, only intention. Tell the world he was not alone. The simplicity of the message concealed its weight. It reframed everything. The narrative of a solitary star, the myth of self-sufficiency, the assumption that his smile had been sustained by applause alone. She did not want sympathy. She did not want gratitude. She wanted accuracy. Songyun described receiving the message as both relief and burden. Relief, because the silence was finally permitted to end. Burden, because once spoken, the truth could no longer be protected from interpretation. They waited until the moment felt right. The decision to speak was not unanimous. There were concerns about misrepresentation, about intrusion, about whether revealing the truth now would undo the care with which it had been guarded. But there was also recognition that keeping it hidden forever would turn love into absence. And absence, left unaddressed, becomes distortion. When they finally chose to speak, they did so without names, without faces, without details that could be extracted and consumed. They spoke carefully, offering shape without exposure. This was not a confession. It was a correction. They did not ask the audience to grieve differently. They asked them to understand differently, to reconsider what strength looks like, to recognize that survival within fame often depends on what remains unseen. The promise that had buried the truth had also preserved it, kept it intact, untouched by rumor, untested by speculation. It had waited patiently for a moment when it could be received rather than devoured. Now that moment had arrived, and with it came an uncomfortable realization that sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones we are never meant to witness directly. They exist not to inspire audiences, but to sustain individuals. They are quiet by design. She never asked to be remembered. She asked for him to be understood. She did not want the world to know her name. She only wanted the world to know that he was not alone. When the final words were spoken in the studio, there was no applause waiting to follow. The audience remained standing, suspended in a moment that resisted closure. This was not the kind of revelation that demanded reaction. It required absorption. The image of Yu Menglong returned to the screen. The same familiar smile the world had memorized. Yet now, it carried a different weight. Not because it had changed, but because what surrounded it had finally been stripped away. For years, his life had been understood through fragments, roles, appearances, carefully curated moments designed to reassure an audience that everything was under control. What had been missing was not drama. It was context. We often mistake visibility for truth. We assume that what we are allowed to see is complete. This story exposed the flaw in that assumption. It revealed that the most defining relationships in a person's life may leave no public trace at all. Yu Menglong belonged to the world in the way public figures do, through admiration, through repetition, through collective memory. But his private existence followed a different logic. It was sustained not by recognition, but by presence. By someone willing to remain unnamed so he could remain whole. This realization unsettles because it forces a recalibration. It asks us to reconsider how we measure fulfillment. Whether applause is nourishment or merely noise. Whether being seen is always a form of being known. The woman at the center of this story never asked to be acknowledged. Her refusal was not an act of humility. It was an assertion of boundaries. She understood that some truths survive only if protected from spectacle. That love, once consumed, rarely emerges intact. By choosing silence, she preserved something rare, a memory unedited by opinion, a relationship free from narrative demands. She did not disappear because she lacked courage. She disappeared because she possessed restraint. There is a quiet dignity in that choice. In the aftermath, nothing tangible changed. No new facts about his death emerged. No mysteries were solved. Yet something essential shifted. The image of a solitary star dissolved, replaced by a more accurate portrait. A man who carried pressure, who tired, who sought refuge, who was, at crucial moments, held together by someone whose name we will never know. This was not a scandal revealed too late. It was a correction offered at the only moment it could be received without distortion. The studio lights brightened again, but gently this time. Not to expose, but to conclude. As the audience slowly returned to their seats, the noise of the outside world felt distant. For a brief moment, restraint had prevailed over intrusion. We are left not with answers, but with a responsibility. To remember that every public figure contains a private life that does not exist for our consumption. That behind every polished image may exist a quiet place where performance ends. Yu Menglong will continue to be remembered for his work. That is inevitable. But now, there is space to remember something else. That he was not defined solely by his success. That he was capable of exhaustion, fear, tenderness, and trust. That he was loved, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply enough to be protected even after he was gone. And sometimes, that is the most honest legacy a person can leave behind.